Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 72 of the History Lost in Time podcast. This podcast is available in German and English and can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Podcast.de, Blue Sky and Instagram. There's also a music-based partner project on YouTube called HLIT AI Music. The topic of this episode. In this episode, I want to explain why I talk so much about the Weimar Republic. In short, I think we can learn a lot from this era, specifically things that aren't generally associated with the Weimar Republic. Especially now in the 2020s, we should take a close look at the 1920s and gain new insights for our own political and social lives. Because the Weimar Republic shouldn't just be seen as a warning of doom, but as a laboratory of possibilities. Political agenda and background. This is less a historical episode and more meta-historical, combined with my own commentary. It would be easy to push this topic into the channels of daily politics, but that's precisely what I don't want to do. First, in my opinion, there are already enough political influencers commenting on current affairs online. Second, who cares about my opinion? I am just another guy after all. I don't hold any political office and I'm not running for office. So why would anyone care about my opinion? What I do have is perhaps a slightly above average knowledge of the Weimar Republic, which is why that's my topic. And third, recommendations for daily political action are outdated after a few weeks or months anyway. But fundamental political and social ideas and concepts endure for centuries. The sources that were used. As primary sources for the Weimar Republic, I can recommend the following two books. Hans Mommsen, Rise and Fall of the Weimar Republic, 1918-33, Ullstein Propyläen, Berlin, 1998, Nadine Rossol and Benjamin Ziemann, Upheaval and Abyss, The Handbook of the Weimar Republic, WBG, Darmstadt 2021. I also incorporated a lot of daily news from recent years and some online research. German history, as it is often portrayed, is very Hitler-centric. Everything after Hitler originates with him, and everything before Hitler leads back to him. According to this logic, the Weimar Republic was a concept that was doomed to fail and inevitably ended with Hitler. And the Federal Republic of Germany is the consequence of Hitler's triumph over the Weimar Republic. The traditional lessons that history draws from the Weimar Republic are therefore the following three. 1. Democracy must be able to defend itself and combat its enemies. This led to the possibility of banning extremist organizations and parties, as was the case with the bans on the Communist Party of Germany KPD and the Nazi successor party, the Socialist Reich Party SRP, in the 1950s. 2. The state must be economically stable and capable of either preventing or mitigating the social consequences of events like the hyperinflation of 1923 and the Great Depression of 1929. This ultimately led to the social market economy as a countermodel to the free market economy without social safety nets. 3. Democracy is not a set it up once and then it just works type of thing, but an ongoing process that requires an active civil society. Compromise, the protection of minorities, the defense of values, and skepticism towards simplistic solutions must be deeply rooted in the population. These traditional insights were incorporated into the design of the Federal Republic of Germany in the late 1940s and proved successful in the Bonn Republic. I use this term to describe the period from approximately 1949 to 99. During this time, there was an extremely strong political center, a broad consensus on key socio-political issues, few parties, clear political camps, and relatively simple, stable political majorities. Apart from the period from 1949 to 53, two-party coalitions were almost always in power, and forming a majority was quite straightforward. Since 2000, the situation has become more difficult. New political parties have formed on both the left and right of the political spectrum. The Left Party, which emerged from the PDS, the BSW, and the AfD. Potentially, we now have 7 parties in parliament, or 8 if we include the free voters. The traditional mainstream parties, the CDU-CSU and SPD, are no longer vying for 50% or 40% of the vote, but rather for 20 to 30%. Together, they barely achieve 50% of the vote, and three-party coalitions are no longer unusual. In some situations, even 4 or 5 parties might be necessary for a coalition. These multi-party coalitions are considered difficult. Politicians and commentators say that finding compromises in such coalitions is difficult, if not impossible. A Weimar chancellor would probably just scoff at that. 3 parties were the minimum in a Weimar coalition. 4 or 5 parties were the norm. The Grand Coalition of 1928 comprised the 5 parties SPD, Center Party, BVP, DDP and DVP, a spectrum ranging from left-wing socialists to right-wing industrialists. And the bourgeois bloc coalition also governed with 5 parties: Center Party, BVP, DDP, DVP and DNVP. Everything from left liberal DDP members to borderline far-right DNVP politicians. Of course, these coalitions were difficult, and finding compromises was anything but easy. But it worked, because it had to. In today's politics, we sometimes see similar difficulties in two-party constellations, not just in three-party alliances. Perhaps in the end it depends more on who governs there and how people treat each other, and not how many people govern there. So what can we learn from Weimar? 1. Multi-party coalitions can also work if there is a will to do so and a genuine willingness to compromise. 2. Some two-party coalitions in the Berlin Republic achieve less than the multi-party coalitions of the Weimar era. 3. What is important is the want to govern and shape policy, not the desire to be in opposition one day and in government the next, depending on the issue. Another point is the type of government. In the Federal Republic of Germany, there have only ever been majority coalitions. In the Weimar era, however, minority coalitions were the rule, majority coalitions the exception. Minority governments functioned through the authority of the president, who could appoint a chancellor. In the Federal Republic, there is no such tradition of minority governments. However, this does exist in other European countries, and the Basic Law, Germany's constitution, has provisions for this eventuality. In the election of the chancellor, a candidate must secure an absolute majority in the Bundestag, the German parliament, in both the first and second rounds of voting. If this is not achieved, the candidate with the most votes wins in the third round, regardless of whether they achieve a majority or not. The president then has the choice. He can appoint the candidate with the most votes as chancellor, or dissolve the Bundestag and call new elections. And once elected, a chancellor can only be removed by electing another chancellor. Thus, the stability of the government would be guaranteed, albeit in a different way than before. A minority government would also increase the pressure on the opposition. Put simply, the opposition can currently reject everything and promise anything. However, with a minority government dependent on shifting majorities, there could be competition between the opposition parties, as they would then be able to push through their goals in specific policy areas, provided cooperation with the government is successful. In Weimar, bourgeois minority governments were able to implement measures sometimes with the SPD, sometimes with the DNVP. This created a certain rivalry between the SPD and the DNVP. Of course, a government is always under pressure to act, but it would no longer be so one-sided. Minority governments have already existed at the state level in Germany, for example in Magdeburg in the 1990s, when an alliance of the SPD and the Greens was tolerated by the PDS, the predecessor of the Left Party. Of course, majority governments are always preferable, but if that doesn't work out, one shouldn't rule out new options, or in this case, very old ones. A minority government can be better than an all-party government that paralyzes itself. Next point, voting behavior. Here I have to mention current events, even though I fear that this will trigger further political discussions. But to make my point clear, I have no choice. I am choosing these two examples neutrally because, in my opinion, they well illustrate the problem I want to describe. So, no political debate, please, okay? Good. So, some may recall, before the 2025 election, the CDU, CSU, and FDP voted together with the AfD in the Bundestag. And more recently, the Greens voted with the AfD in the European Parliament. What was it about? Frankly, not important, but for the sake of completeness, in the Bundestag it was about migration, and in the European Parliament it was about postponing the Mercosur free trade agreement with South America. In both cases, a shitstorm ensued because of the question of who voted with whom, not what the actual issue was. In today's moralizing world, it's therefore not enough to push through what one considers right. It must also be done against the votes of the moral opponent, not with their votes. That didn't happen in Weimar. Of course, the SPD, KPD, NSDAP, and DNVP rarely agreed there either, but sometimes they did. For example, in votes of no confidence against bourgeois minority coalitions. On the issue of expropriating the princes, the SPD and KPD voted together. On the armored cruiser project, they were sworn enemies. On the Dawes plan, the DNVP and SPD voted together in favor, but on the Young plan, 5 years later, they were at odds. So it was about who and what it's about, not only about who. Especially at the local level, there are many issues that aren't ideologically or morally charged. Hypothetical examples. What gets renovated first, the school or the kindergarten? Will the road be renewed in Village A or Village B? Should we expand broadband internet in District A now, or should we do it in 2 years when the sewer system needs to be replaced anyway? These are all issues where federal and state political ideologies play no role, and where even now parties with opposing views vote together or against each other without fuss. It was the same in Weimar. Perhaps we should remember that, because if you personally believe that something is right, it shouldn't matter who else agrees. Finally, I would like to address the area of language and culture. Here, 3 distinct periods in German history can be clearly identified: the Weimar Republic, the Bonn Republic, and the Berlin Republic. To illustrate this, I am exaggerating, simplifying, and generalizing. Of course, there are always exceptions. In the Weimar Republic, political parties were firmly rooted in specific social milieus and maintained close ties with them. Politicians knew whom they represented. Political debates were fierce, and deep divisions existed between politicians and these milieus. The opponent was not merely a competitor, but rather an outsider, a social adversary, or even an ideological enemy. Political rhetoric was harsh and brutal, and confrontations were sometimes violent, ultimately resembling civil war. In the Bonn Republic, 2 major parties emerged, transcending social strata, the CDU-CSU and the SPD, as well as 2 niche parties for specific social groups, the Greens and the FDP. While the internal debates were equally fierce, the rhetoric was milder and interactions outside parliament in tranquil Bonn could be informal and even friendly. While the parties argued vehemently on the issues, they were not bitter enemies, as their opponents were competitors, not mortal foes. This is why, for example, the CDU-CSU and SPD were able to engage in intense debates in the 1950s, yet govern relatively successfully together in the Grand Coalition during the 1960s. The Berlin Republic began like the Bonn Republic, but is clearly developing in the direction of Weimar-era patterns of behavior. Instead of ideologies, it is now moralizing that creates division. The opponent is no longer a competitor, but simply evil, and must therefore be fought. And one does not compromise with evil. Evil is not misunderstood, but rather desires only harm for the people and the country. One must therefore not give in, and anyone who does reaps a shitstorm and is so thoroughly attacked that they have to resign, purely for their own protection. This is incidentally a phenomenon that can be observed across all political camps and is not practiced only by individual parties or groups. Here we should look more at the Bonn Republic for guidance, because we know where those harsh and irreconcilable conflicts in Weimar led. In Bonn, there were always informal circles where Social Democrats and Greens, Social Democrats and Socialists, and also Christian Democrats and Greens met and talked to each other. This didn't immediately lead to cooperation, but it did lead to mutual understanding. People recognized that the other side might think similarly on some issues, and regarding the points of contention, they at least understood why the other side thought that way. Perhaps the others had good reason for their position, even if one didn't agree with them. A few finishing words. So what can we learn from the Weimar and Bonn republics? 1. Multi-party coalitions don't have to be more difficult than two-party alliances if the individuals and parties involved are willing to cooperate. 2. Minority governments are a viable option. 3. Just because the opponent agrees to your proposals doesn't mean you should consider them tainted and discard them. 4. Language and culture shape and influence the environment. Those who view others as enemies and evil will sooner or later find themselves in violent conflict. And one shouldn't make the mistake of believing that one can win without resistance from the opponent. Opponents always react. I therefore advise you to step outside your own echo chambers. Today they are digital echo chambers. In Weimar they were party newspapers and social circles. In Bonn, on the other hand, there was the Tagesschau, Germany's main evening news program for everyone, and the corner pubs, where all social classes met and talked to each other. Talk with each other, not about each other, and do it offline, not in comment sections. Ask why the other person thinks the way they do. Try to understand whether the other side is acting the way they are based on their own experiences. And a personal plea to those in power. No more coalition agreements, hundreds of pages long. They take forever to finalize and are outdated after just a few months. Want some examples? Olaf Scholz had to deal primarily with the war in Ukraine and its consequences. Was that mentioned in his 2021 coalition agreement? Absolutely not. Angela Merkel's surprises during her chancellorship could fill volumes. Keywords: COVID, migration, Fukushima and the nuclear crisis, Euro crisis, financial crisis. And the Red-Green coalition of 1998 certainly didn't intend to become militarily active in Kosovo and Afghanistan. And yet they did. A coalition agreement shouldn't be a 4-year plan to be mechanically implemented. Instead, it should define a mechanism for resolving issues and reaching compromises without giving the impression that the government is hopelessly divided and incapable of action. In the Bonn Republic, agreements of less than 20 pages were sufficient, and in Weimar there were no such agreements at all. Gustav Stresemann was able to implement the 1923 currency reform without a coalition agreement. and Hans Luther was subsequently able to balance the budget without one. Therefore, my plea to those in positions of power: start thinking about how you will deal with the next crisis, the nature and timing of which you don't yet know. But the fact that one is coming is absolutely certain in our chaotic times of multiple crises. And my plea to all fellow citizens: set a good example for those in positions of power. Listen to one another, be compassionate, help one another. If you can't influence the big picture, you should at least try to mitigate the damage done on a smaller scale. Do I always manage to do that myself? Certainly not. But one should still continue to try. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.